are not imagining it. The moment you finally set a boundary, people often get worse, not better. They do not just disagree, they test you. They poke the edge like it is still negotiable. And if you do not understand why that happens, you will misread the entire situation and either collapse the boundary or escalate into a fight you did not need. Quick thing before we go deeper. We are building toward 1,000 subscribers, and your subscription genuinely helps this channel reach people who want psychology that actually explains what is going on. And if this hits something you have lived through, tap like too, because that is the signal that tells the algorithm this is worth showing to more people. Now let us get precise. When people test you after you set a boundary, it is rarely because they are simply selfish. Sometimes they are, but even then, there is a mechanism. A boundary is not just a request. It is a sudden rewrite of the rules of the relationship. And humans are extremely sensitive to rule changes because relationships are basically invisible contracts. Most of what you call conflict is contract renegotiation, happening out loud. You have felt this. You say, calmly, I am not doing that anymore, or do not speak to me that way, or I need you to call before you come over. And suddenly the other person acts confused, offended, joking, angry, or weirdly charming. They might say, wow, okay, someone is sensitive, or I guess I cannot do anything right, or since when do you have these rules? That reaction is not random, it is diagnostic. It tells you what they think the relationship is for. Here is what is actually happening. When you set a boundary, you create uncertainty about three things at once: your future behavior, your social status, and the cost of crossing you. People test boundaries to reduce uncertainty, not to understand your feelings. They want to learn the new price of their old behavior. Think about this for a second. If you go to a store and the sign says no returns, you might still ask the cashier, right? Not because you are evil, because signs are sometimes fake. Policies are sometimes flexible. Some employees bend. You test to find the real rule. A boundary is the same. People probe because they do not trust your first statement. They trust what happens after they push. Now here is where it gets interesting. The first test is often not conscious. It can be automatic. Your boundary triggers a prediction error in their brain. In neuroscience terms, the brain is a prediction machine. It is constantly forecasting what will happen next to conserve energy. If you have been the person who tolerates, explains, smooths things over, or says yes under pressure, then their brain has a low-cost model of you. When you set a boundary, you generate an error signal. Wait, that is not how this person works, and the fastest way to update a model is to test it. So the first time they cross your boundary after you stated it, do not just see it as disrespect. See it as a data-gathering move. They are running an experiment. Is this boundary a statement, or is it a phase? Is it real, or is it performative? Is it attached to consequences, or is it just language? And you can literally watch the experiment design. They often start with something small, a joke, a mistake, a forgot, a slight tone, because they want plausible deniability. They want to test without paying the social cost of looking openly aggressive. If you let the small violation slide, they learned what they needed to learn. The boundary was verbal, not structural. This is why people who are new to boundaries feel like setting one made their life worse. It did not. It revealed the incentives that were already there. It revealed who was relying on your lack of friction. Let me show you a deeper layer. There are different kinds of boundary testing, and if you cannot distinguish them, you will respond wrong. Type 1 is calibration. This is a basically normal human process. Someone is adjusting to the new version of you. They might stumble, complain a little, even push once or twice, but they are not trying to dominate you. They are trying to map the new terrain. Their test looks like this. They push, you restate and hold, and then they adapt. They might not love it, but they respect it. Type 2 is control maintenance. This is where the other person is not just mapping the terrain. They are trying to prevent the terrain from changing. Your boundary threatens their access, their convenience, or their identity as the one who sets terms. So they push harder, and they use emotional tactics, not logic. They do not ask, "Can we find a way that works?" They say things that make you doubt your right to have needs at all, and type 3 is status contest. This one is subtle. Sometimes people test your boundary because they think boundaries are status plays. In a lot of families and workplaces, boundaries are not seen as healthy communication. They are seen as power moves. So when you set one, they interpret it as you trying to rise in rank, and if they care about rank, they will push back to see if you can actually hold the position you just claimed. Notice the pattern here. The testing is not always about the boundary itself. It is about what the boundary implies. It implies you are willing to tolerate less. It implies you might walk away. It implies you are not as available for manipulation. It implies you are no longer playing the old role. Now, let us talk about roles, because this is one of the most overlooked mechanisms. In many relationships, you are not relating as two individuals. You are relating as two roles in a system: the peacekeeper and the critic, the responsible one and the reckless one, the helper and the helpless one, the one who explains and the one who does not get it. Systems resist change. And in family systems theory, when one person changes their pattern, the system often reacts to restore equilibrium. Not because the system hates you, but because the system has been stable. So when you set a boundary, you disrupt equilibrium. And other people, without thinking, will try to pull you back into the old role because it makes their role easier. If you were the overfunctioner, your boundary forces someone else to underfunction less. If you were the emotional trash can, your boundary forces them to metabolize their own stress. If you were the fixer, your boundary forces them to face consequences. That is why they test. Your boundary creates a bill they were not planning to pay. But here is the part most people miss. Sometimes they test you because they are attached to a story about who they are. They might see themselves as easygoing, generous, funny, brutally honest, the one who keeps it real. Your boundary threatens that identity. If you say, "Do not joke about my body," they are not only hearing a limit, they are hearing, "You are not funny, you are cruel." If you say, "I am not available after 9, they hear, "You are not special to me." People defend identities like they defend territory. This is where defensive aggression comes from, not always malice, sometimes shame. Shame is the emotion of being demoted in your own eyes. And when people feel shame, they often externalize it. They make you the problem so they do not have to feel the demotion. So watch for this line. "I guess I am the bad guy." That is not accountability. That is shame theatre. The hidden request is, "Comfort me so I do not have to change." If you comfort them, and the boundary dissolves. Stay with me, because this next part recontextualizes everything. The most intense boundary testing often happens with the people who benefited from your previous inconsistency, not your previous kindness. A lot of advice says, people will respect you more when you set boundaries. Sometimes. But the more accurate statement is, people will treat you according to the consistency of your boundaries, not the existence of them. In behavioral psychology, intermittent reinforcement creates the strongest habits. That is the schedule that makes gambling addictive. If you sometimes say no, but then give in when they pressure you, you have trained them to pressure you. You taught them that persistence works. So when you finally set a clean boundary, their brain does what a gambler brain does. It escalates. It tries harder. Not because it hates you, but because the old schedule taught it that one more push might pay off. This is why the pushback often spikes right after you get serious. The system is running extinction bursts. In learning theory, when a behavior that used to be rewarded stops being rewarded, the behavior temporarily increases before it decreases. That is exactly what boundary testing is, an extinction burst. If you have ever thought, it got worse when I started standing up for myself, yes, that is the burst. And if you fold during the burst, you do something dangerous. You do not just lose the boundary, you teach them that maximum pressure works best. You strengthen the very behavior you were trying to end. Now here is another layer, and it is uncomfortable. Some people test you because they need you to be the person with fewer options. That is how they feel safe. In attachment terms, if someone has anxious attachment, your boundary can feel like abandonment. They test because they want reassurance. They might blow up, then suddenly soften, then accuse you of not caring. The test is, will you chase me and prove I matter? If someone has avoidant attachment, your boundary can feel like a demand. They test by withdrawing, minimizing, or mocking. The test is, will you back off so I do not have to be accountable? So the same behavior, boundary testing, can be driven by different fears. Fear of losing you, fear of being controlled, fear of being exposed, fear of losing status. That is why generic advice fails. You have to identify the driver. Let me give you a practical way to do that without psychoanalyzing for hours. Listen to the first sentence they say after you set the boundary. It usually reveals the motive. If they say, "Why are you doing this to me?" they are making your boundary about their pain. That is anxiety or entitlement. If they say, "That is ridiculous," they are dismissing the legitimacy of the boundary. That is a status move. If they say, "You are overreacting," they are trying to control your interpretation of reality. That is often emotional manipulation, sometimes called gaslighting when it is persistent. If they say, "Okay, I did not realize, I will try," that is calibration. And if they say, "Fine, then I will just not talk to you at all," that is coercion. That is them turning your boundary into a threat so you will retract it. Now flip everything I just said. Sometimes people test you after you set a boundary because they are not actually testing you. They are testing whether you mean what you say about yourself. This is the brutal part. A boundary is not primarily a message to them. It is a commitment to you. And people can sense when you are negotiating with yourself. If your voice says no, but your body says, "Please do not leave me," they feel that conflict. Humans are extremely good at reading hesitation, especially in close relationships. Micropauses, nervous laughter, over-explaining, moral lectures instead of consequences. Those are tells. So they test because they sense a gap between your statement and your self-trust. They are not always consciously exploiting it. They just feel that the rule might not hold. This is why the strongest boundaries are often the simplest. One sentence. No courtroom speech. No autobiography. Not because you owe no explanation, but because explanation is sometimes a leak of uncertainty. The mechanism behind effective boundaries is not aggression. It is coherence. Your words, tone, and follow-through match. Now, what do you do with all of this in real life without turning into a cold robot? Here is the framework I use. I call it the 3 layers of a boundary: signal, structure, and self. Signal is what you say, the line, the request, the limit. Structure is what changes in the environment if the line is crossed, not punishment. Structure. For example, you end the call, you leave the room, you reschedule, you stop sharing certain information, You reduce access, you create friction. Self is the internal peace, your willingness to tolerate their discomfort, your guilt, and your own withdrawal symptoms from being the accommodating one. Most people only do signal. They announce, they explain, they hope, and then they are shocked when people test. Testing is predictable because signal without structure is just sound. The payoff is this. Once you add structure, you do not need to argue about intent. You do not need them to agree with your boundary. You only need to operate your structure consistently. Boundaries are not debates. They are designs. And here is a subtle but powerful move. Name the test without accusing. I already answered that. If you ask again, I will end the conversation. That is not moralizing. That is clarity. It tells their brain, there is no new information here. The experiment is over. If it is calibration, they adapt. If it is control maintenance, they escalate, which gives you more data. If it is an anxiety-driven test, they might protest, but then you can offer reassurance without surrendering the boundary. I care about you. And the answer is still no. And if it is a status contest, consistency beats intensity. You do not have to win a speech. You have to hold a line. The ultimate insight is this. People test you after you set a boundary because boundaries expose the true economy of the relationship. Who pays what? Who benefits? Who carries discomfort? Who gets to define reality? A boundary forces a redistribution, and anytime you redistribute costs in a system, the system reacts. So do not ask, why are they acting like this? Ask a more useful question. What did my lack of boundary previously make free for them? Free attention, free emotional labor, free access, free forgiveness, free flexibility. Your boundary is simply you ending a subsidy. If that sounds harsh, good. Harsh is sometimes just accurate. And one more thing, because this is where your power actually is. The goal is not to make them stop testing. The goal is to make the test boring. When the test reliably produces the same outcome, it loses its function. Your job is not to persuade. Your job is to become predictable. If you want a challenge for the next week, notice who respects your boundary on the second try and who needs the 10th. That difference is not personality. It is incentive. If this changed how you see the pushback you have been getting, tell me in the comments what kind of test you are dealing with, calibration, control, or status. And remember this, the next time someone acts offended by your limit, the boundary did not create the conflict. It just exposed who was relying on your silence.